Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the Organic Man Coffee Trike.shop. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. My wife suggested I do a show on near-death experiences, and so here it is. It's a good idea to stay as far away from death as you can. Sometimes it's just unavoidable. A death might be hiding around the next corner or come down the street not paying attention to signal lights. Things happen all the time, and we're just lucky to move from point A to point B without having a life-changing, literally, moment. I had bullets pass over my head one night. Try not to duck when you hear the zinging sound. When you hear the sound, the bullet's already gone by. However, some guy in Nuevo Laredo was taking shots at us. At first, we heard the gunshots and wondered what was going on, but when we heard the bullets hit the tree right behind us, that's when we both dove for cover and tried hiding behind this little rock. We called the radio room and told them we were being shot at from Mexico, and they called Mexico and told them what was going on. And about 20 minutes later, we saw a police car over in Nuevo Laredo driving real slow through the neighborhood. By that time, the guy with the rifle was already far gone, but things like that happen. However, that's not what a near-death experience is. That's just a bad moment. I had several occasions to get way too close to the guy in the long black robe and the scythe. That's not what we're talking about here either. Near death is when you're already crossing over to the next plane of existence and somehow you wind up turning around and coming back. Near-death experiences, also called NDEs, are triggered during singular life-threatening episodes when the body is injured by either a heart attack, some form of shock, a blunt trauma injury, something like that, where the person is gone for all intents and purposes, and then they come back without all that walking around looking for brains. When I research a show, I sometimes find so many websites to sort through, it takes me days to get the show ready. This time I ran into a different problem. Too many stories that had tons of information. Some of these things were pages and pages long, and I had to whittle them down a bit, otherwise y'all would get bored real quick. Plato was born about 400 years BC. He was well known as a philosopher. He was born in Athens, Greece. He wrote an account of a person who was killed, went to his judgment, and then returned to tell us about it. Plato wrote about a warrior named the son of Amynus. Back then you had one name, so to differentiate folks, they would also mention your father's name. People spoke very differently back then, so here is what Plato said, sort of in English. Was slain in battle, and when the corpses were taken up on the 10th day, already decayed, he was found intact, and having been brought home, at the moment of his funeral on the 12th day, as he lay on the pyre, revived, and after coming to life related what he said he had seen in the world beyond. He said that when his soul went forth from his body, he journeyed with a great company, and that they came to a mysterious region where there were two openings side by side in the earth, and above and over against them in the heavens two others, and that judges were sitting between these, and that after every judgment they bade the righteous journey to the right and upwards through the heaven, with tokens attached to them in front of the judgment passed upon them, and the unjust to take the road to the left and downwards, they too wearing behind signs of all that had befallen them, and that when he himself drew near, they told him that he must be the messenger to humanity to tell them of that other world, and they charged him to give ear and observe everything in the place. They spoke weird back then. I'll change back to plain English, so I don't get a headache and y'all don't turn the video off. Found himself standing before a group of judges. There were 4 tunnels, 2 on the right that went up to heaven, 2 on the left that descended into the ground. Saw hundreds of dead humans lined up in front of the judges. As each would present themselves, the judges who would decide where to send their souls. The good folks were all directed to the tunnel on the right that ascended to the heavens. Those found lacking were directed to the left-hand tunnel that headed down into the ground. Those directed to the right were happy and kind of singing as they went up into the heavens. They were going home. The left-hand tunnel was filled with crying and weeping and really, really sad spirits, because they knew where they were going. Also observed spirits coming down from above. They were happy and clean looking. Based on their previous lives, these spirits were given the opportunity to choose their next life, reincarnation. They were sent back to Earth to a decent life filled with good things. At the same time, other souls were coming up from below. These were dirty and bedraggled looking. Based on their sins, these spirits were assigned a new life where their suffering would continue based on just how bad they had been during their previous life. Saw there were a lot of spirits trying to escape from the left-hand tunnel, but they were stuck in the underground. These were the worst of the worst, probably politicians, that were to spend all of eternity in the underground. The ancient Greeks didn't have a term for hell, so they just called it the underground or the underworld. Hades was the god in charge of the underworld. Later, people began calling the underworld Hades. Hell didn't show up for another 400 years after Jesus. All these spirits were waiting with to return to the earth. Once everybody was ready, the group was sent away from the judges and told to walk along a path that led out to a huge meadow. And the released spirits had to walk for 11 days. At the end of their journey, they came to a group of women. Lady Necessity, her daughters, and the sirens. The souls were organized into rows and were each given a lottery token. Now, this would determine where their soul would reincarnate, although they didn't use the term. Watched as each spirit was assigned a new life. After the last spirit was gone, was sent back to his own body to tell the people of Earth what was waiting for them in the afterlife. Why was he picked to witness the afterlife and then return? No one knows. Plato didn't go into that part of the story, or perhaps he didn't know either. Maybe was considered good enough to be given a second chance. In Moscow, neuropathologist George Rodania, an avowed atheist, died after he was hit by a car in 1976. He was pronounced DRT. That's dead right there. Some of y'all would recognize it as DOS, dead on scene. His body was left for 3 days in the morgue. A doctor began to make an incision in his abdomen as part of an autopsy. George came to. He woke up. He came back from the dead. George was taken from the morgue to a hospital room for his recovery. Soon, George was remembering what had happened while he was on the other side. He said he started out in total darkness. He tried looking around, but there was nothing. He was scared of where he might be. His mind kept running a thought through his head. How can I be when I'm not? That was a highly troubling thought. He began to remember what had happened to him, the car running him down, and the ambulance showing up, someone looking at him and saying, "Nope, he's gone," followed by the darkness. A new thought came to him. He remembered Descartes' famous line, "I think, therefore I am," and that took a huge burden off. If he was still thinking, he was still alive. But alive where? He focused on being George. He tried to think positive thoughts. If darkness was negative, then light must be positive. As this idea entered his mind, light filled the area around him. In the light, he saw what must have been molecules flying around. This elevated most of his fears. He saw the universe taking form in front of his eyes. His body faded away as the universe grew into focus. He decided he didn't need that old beat-up, broken body anymore. Shortly, he went through what he calls a life review. The whole life flashing before his eyes kind of thing. Everything seemed to merge together, so it was difficult for him to put things into sequence of events. Time, as he known it, came to a halt. Past, present, and future were somehow fused together. His entire life story was one scene. He was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. George became aware of his family. He tried to communicate with them, but they didn't hear him. Some did act as if they heard something, but they didn't know what or who was trying to communicate. George was enjoying his newfound place in the universe when he felt a pain in his abdomen. It felt like a knife was being used on him. He felt a great power grab him by the neck and shove him back into his old body. The pain was not something he could ignore, so he looked down to see what was going on. He felt cold and stiff. He felt as if he were laying on a steel table and somebody was opening him up. I would love to have seen the look on the pathologist's face when he looked at the dead man laying before him and suddenly his eyes opened. I'll bet that was a life-changing moment. No, really, the dead guy came back to life. George spent the next 9 months, kind of like he was going through birth, in a hospital bed. His first wish, once he'd talked to his family, was to study and learn more from the folks who might understand what he'd been through. George enrolled in the University of Georgia, the one on the other side of the ocean. Georgia, the country, not the state. He studied philosophy and religion. George enrolled and became a priest in the Eastern Orthodox Church. In 1989, he immigrated to the United States and became a pastor at the First United Methodist Church in Nederland, Texas. Later, he served as a pastor at St. Paul United Methodist Church in Baytown, Texas. I know a guy from Romania. He moved to Texas and is a state trooper today. I know two guys from England. One lives in Texas and the other one is in Phoenix, Arizona. I can't understand how a person can decide to move from one country with vastly different culture and weather and come to Texas. I mean, I was born here. I love my state. But to come from countries that are moderate to cold weather and rainy and come to Texas where it rains hardly ever and it's always hot, or Phoenix, Arizona where it's really hot, don't understand it, but hey, they're people too, so. George has said that God is not the light, but there is no way to describe what God is because he is incomprehensible. He said God is also the darkness. Now, George is intent on teaching others about God and how we are all part of the same universe and we should try to get along and stop worrying about the physical things and focus on the spiritual. He also said, no one will ever understand what life is until we understand eternal death. The poet Rilke once wrote in a letter to a friend, George saw the original handwritten letter in the library in Dresden University in Germany. It had a profound impact on him because he can quote it word for word. Strange noises in the background. The letter said, be patient with all that is unresolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves. The Daleks are attacking. Do not seek for the answers that cannot be given, for you wouldn't be able to live with them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now, and perhaps without knowing it, you will live long someday into the answers. I guess the answer is not 42. Forgot to turn the Do Not Disturb on, or off. More information about George's NDE account is described in Dr. Melvin Morris and Paul Perry's book entitled Transformed by the Light. Now, Dr. Morris refers to George by his Russian name, which is Yuri. That would mean that Yuri Gagarin was actually George Gagarin. That's Russian to English. Dr. Mary Neal, an orthopedic spine surgeon from Wyoming, experienced a near-death experience well, that was redundant. She had a near-death experience while kayaking in Chile. Her kayak flipped and she wound up underwater. Unable to get to the surface, she drowned. As her body slowly resurfaced, she felt herself floating up out of the water and up into the air. Her spirit wound up in a place she thought must have been heaven. Mary was surrounded by other spirits. Some were family that had died years previous. She also discovered that she could look down and see her body being pulled from the water by her friends who were all frantically trying to revive her. Mary was guided to a huge dome-shaped structure where she encountered a being as she believed was God. She was told it was not her time to be in that place and that she had to return to Earth. She was also told that her son was going to die soon, long before she did. Mary was suddenly back in her body with all her friends around, frantically trying to revive her. They were amazed to see her take a breath. Neal tried to put into words all the things that she had seen and experienced while in her NDE. She now knew her son was going to die, yet it didn't bother her as much as it should, because she knew that he was going to return to that place that she had just visited. When her near-death experience took place, her son Willie was 9 years old. He was eventually killed in a vehicle accident in 2009 at the age of 19. Mellon Thomas Benedict was born March 2nd, 1949, in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Several weeks after Benedict was born, he had an NDE when his bowels were ruptured. His body was moved to the side table since the doctors didn't think he was going to make it. This was a long time ago, before they had all the fancy machines and drugs to keep you alive. To everyone's surprise, he survived and he recovered. As soon as he was big enough to hold a crayon, he began to create symbolic renditions of the black and white yin and yang circles of Eastern religious thought. He has no memory of why he drew these particular symbols, but he drew them a lot. He had retired from a frenzy of working on films and was operating his own stained glass studio. In 1982, Mellon was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer. As his condition worsened, he spent more and more time doing artwork. One morning he awoke knowing he was going to die the next day. So he called all of his friends and his family to say goodbye, and the next morning he was found dead. Benedict recognized what was happening as it was happening. The process was familiar to him because he had read books about near-death experiences. Shortly thereafter, he died, and he lived to tell about it. He was dead for over an hour and a half. At the time of his death, he rose up out of his body and went into the light. Now, why can't something as simple as dying not be simple? Some people are saying that when we die, we should not go towards the light or into the tunnel, because this could lead to us reincarnating for the benefits of deceptive, self-serving, multidimensional beings. As far as I could find, the folks who did go to the light all came out changed for the better. Haven't found any instances where they came back as a totally different person. Benedict was taken far into the remote depths of existence and even beyond, into the energetic void of nothingness behind the Big Bang. During his experience, he was able to learn a great deal of information concerning reincarnation. He encountered a bright light that he understood was God. He was shown how everything from the past to the far future is already there. Some folks are able to move from one point to another in this time. Knowing he was dead was one thing. Being told he was about to go back, well, it didn't really bother him. He thought he would be reincarnating into a new body. When he awoke in the hospital, he found he was back in his old body. Doctors were surprised he had recovered from being dead. They did all the tests they do, and they could find no sign of his ever having cancer. Unable to explain it, they just wrote it off as being one of those things. Because of his near-death experience, he was able to bring back scientific discoveries. Mr. Benedict has been closely involved in the mechanics of cellular communications and research dealing with the relationship of light and death. Try that again, light and life. They call it quantum biology. This research is providing dramatic new perspectives on how biological systems work. Mr. Benedict has found that living cells can respond very quickly to light stimulation, resulting in high-speed healing. He now holds 6 U.S. patents. Benedict went on to spend much of his later life lecturing on the scientific and spiritual nature of life. I don't know what she's barking at. Gee, man, there's no way to pause the video. I just have to keep recording or... Well, my dog. I guess she sees a monster outside the studio and she's trying to keep it away. Anyway, He lectures a lot at universities and at conferences. Uh, he couldn't exactly say that what he encountered was God because he said it was incomprehensible, but that he knows that he did visit heaven and that he did meet a supreme being. February 2nd, 2006, Anita Morhani was rushed to the emergency room at Hong Kong Sanatorium Hospital and was only given a few hours to live due to the organ failure that was brought on by lymphoma cancer that had been eroding her body since she was diagnosed with cancer in 2002. After 4 years with cancer, her body had had enough and she slipped into a coma. The staff at the hospital did all the things they have to do to try saving a life, even when there's little to no chance that it'll happen. You just don't give up until there's no chance of recovery. They did a full body scan and they examined her extremities. They did blood work and checked all of her vital signs. The doctor found even though she still had a pulse, nothing else was working. Her brain had shut down and all of her organs were no longer doing what they're supposed to. There's a mixed bag of thought when it comes to patients like this. One way of looking at it is why perform so many procedures on a patient that probably was going to die anyway? None of these procedures are cheap, and they pull staff away from other patients who might need them. Most of the cost is then passed on to the insurance companies, who then raise everybody's rates because insurance companies are not in business to give away money. They're in business to make money. And if they're not making money, well, they're not going to be in business very long. The family winds up with a lot of copay that they're going to have to shell out for, even if the person dies. Another group say never give up until you've tried everything. Patients have made miraculous recoveries, and you never know until you tried. Pharmaceutical companies love this idea because every single drug pumped into the patient costs more money than seems reasonable. One of the cheapest drugs out there, aspirin, it costs about 7 cents per tablet if you buy it at the grocery store. But when they give you an aspirin in the hospital, it can cost $1, $1.50. That's over 140% increase. That's all profit. A huge thing hospitals take into consideration when going above and beyond what they consider reasonable treatment of a patient is lawyers. For every 100 students in law school today, there's one job available when they graduate. So this leads to a lot of graduated students becoming ambulance chasers because they're trying to make a buck after spending several thousand becoming a lawyer. All that was left was to sit back and wait for Murjani to pass from this world to the next. Her heart had to stop so the body could be shipped off to the funeral home. Unknown to everybody around her, Murjani was well aware of what was going on. She could see people working on her body. She could see her family all sitting and waiting to be told that she was dead at last. She knew the medical staff were only going through the motions. As far as they were concerned, the patient was already dead. The heart just hadn't figured it out yet. As her organs stopped working, blood was still being pumped around, causing her brain, lungs, kidney, and all the other organs to start filling with fluid. This led to swelling, which is very bad. Her brain was being squeezed as fluid filled what little space there is inside the skull. A weird thing happens when the brain gets compressed. The blood vessels become constricted, reducing the flow of blood. This causes the brain to become starved of oxygen. As the brain needs oxygen, it sends a message to the body increasing the blood pressure. As more blood rushes to the skull, the swelling increases, causing more constriction of the blood vessels, which leads to less oxygen getting to the brain, causing the blood pressure to go up some more. We had a name for this action, but I can't remember it today. It's been a long time since I was a paramedic. Morjani felt herself drifting away from her body. She saw her husband, but she didn't feel sad because she knew she was going to come back. She knew that the medical staff were wrong. She was not going to die. She wanted to tell him not to worry, but no words seemed to reach him. She just kept drifting away, heading up. Her spirit felt as if it were expanding. She no longer felt constrained by her physical being. She was nothing but energy drifting on some unknown current. She encountered a spirit that she recognized as being that of her father. He had died 10 years ago. She encountered another spirit of her best friend who had died a few years ago also. There were many spirits around her, all happy to see her, as she was at peace and filled with joy. There were no words to describe all the things she was experiencing. Let's just say it was like Christmas morning for a kid who found a pile of presents under the tree, all with his name on them. Or how about a guy that just picked up a brand new pickup truck? Well, those of you that don't drive pickups, you don't know what you're missing. She encountered one spirit or being that she perceived as being God. She had no answers to all of her questions. She had all the answers to all of her questions all at once. Anita was aware of other beings around her. She didn't recognize them, but she knew that they all seemed to love her, and she felt that she loved them. She came out of the coma 30 hours later. During those 30 hours, she experienced many details of a near-death experience. Her account includes an out-of-body experience with observations and awareness of the physical surroundings. Anita said she had a strong reluctance to return to her suffering, dying physical body, but was encouraged to return by her father and her best friend, who told her that she needed to return to live her life more fully. The hospital staff had no explanation for her recovery. Within a few days, her tumors had all decreased by 70%. In a few weeks, there was no evidence she had ever even had cancer. Anita wrote about her NDE in a book titled Dying to Be Me, which is available at Amazon.com. In Round Lake, Illinois, Umberto Casas felt his chest start to hurt while riding a bicycle. The pain was radiating to his left arm. That's never a good thing. Not knowing what might be wrong, he called for an ambulance and then he sat and waited. He started to pray while he was sitting there. Pain in the chest that radiates to the left arm is almost always the sign of a heart attack. Not all heart attacks feel pain. Some, the only symptom is difficulty breathing for unknown reasons. It's not like you just ran a marathon, you just can't seem to catch your breath. People don't like the idea of having heart attacks, so they will almost always say that it's something else. Indigestion is the biggest culprit. As Umberto sat there praying, the fear and pain kind of decreased. He began to feel at peace. He was rushed to St. Catherine's Hospital in Wisconsin, where cardiologist Dr. Michael Rosenberg met him for the first time, laying on the operating table. Umberto felt his life was ending. Dr. Rosenberg confirmed that he'd had a widowmaker. A widowmaker heart attack is caused by a 100% blockage of the left anterior descending artery. That's the big artery that runs down the front of the heart and supplies most of the blood that carries oxygen to the heart. If it's blocked, the heart can suddenly stop. That's why it's called a widowmaker. Now, more men than women have heart attacks due to equal rights. Women are trying to catch up. I guess the politically correct term will be surviving spouse maker or some such nonsense like that. You can still be alive while having a heart attack. With cardiac arrest, you're dead. Kaputsky, DRT. Umberto suffered cardiac arrest. His heart stopped. He felt his spirit drifting up out of his body. He said he felt great. There was no pain. They were just happiness, joyfulness. As he drifted up into the sky, he saw what looked like prayers go rushing past him, speeding up into the heavens. He felt as if he was being pulled back down after a few minutes. He awoke inside his own body. When he told his family that he'd seen them all sitting on a couch praying, they told him that they had indeed been sitting on that couch praying that he would come back. This may have been what pulled him back from above. Umberto emphatically discounts the idea that some have that he was just dreaming or hallucinating. He says the experience is engraved in his soul. Dr. Rosenberg confirms that other patients have described their NDE the exact same way as Umberto. Today, he is a lot happier, and he has a message for those mourning the death of loved ones. He says, I don't need to worry, they'll be in a very good place. God is there. On the morning of May 4th, 2006, Dean Braxton woke up with severe pain in his right side. He assumed it was just kidney stones, and he went to work thinking they would pass sometime during the day. The pain increased, and he went home. Eventually, the pain became so severe he had to drive himself to the emergency room at St. Francis Hospital in Federal Way, Washington. When he arrived, there were no other patients in the ER, and so he was taken into the back room right away and given a full exam. They detected an infection had built up around the kidney stones, so they started antibiotics. They called his wife Marilyn, and he was admitted overnight. They planned on trying to remove the kidney stones the next morning. Dean's temperature reached 104 degrees. Doctors chose to perform surgery despite the fever and infection. They used a routine procedure called lithotripsy, which uses shock waves to blast the stones and break them up so they can pass easily. Dean's condition worsened. The infection spread throughout to his other organs, causing multiple organ failure. His breathing became shallow, and his blood pressure began to drop. Then his heart stopped. His wife was praying while the medical team worked feverishly trying to revive him. When Dean's heart had stopped, he left his body. His first memory was traveling at faster than the speed of light. As he moved, he saw people's prayers passing him by as if he were standing still. Prayers for him as well as for others. He knew that Marilyn was praying and that he would come back and that God would heal him. Dean arrived in heaven, and almost immediately he was met by Jesus, who was brighter than the noonday sun. When Jesus looked at him, Dean felt as if Jesus loved him more than anything on the world. And he felt the same way towards Jesus. Then he noticed someone else. He said his grandmother Mary was standing on the side of Jesus, and she stepped forward to greet him. Other relatives were with her, and they joined in welcoming him as well. Some of them he recognized, others he didn't. There were many generations of family members all there welcoming him to heaven. One of these spirits said, "Earth is not your home. You're just passing through. However, we want you to go back to Earth and bring back as many family members with you as possible the next time you come to heaven." All the spirits were speaking in other languages, but Dean could understand each person individually, even though they were all talking at once. Everything in heaven appeared bright, and every being was vibrantly alive. Dean wanted to stay there, but he was told, "No, you're going to have to go back." He was clinically dead for an hour and 45 minutes. When he came back with a weak but steady heart rate, the bacteria in his system had caused severe damage, so the doctors started dialysis. They figured he might survive, but he was never going to be much use to anybody. They thought he was going to be a vegetable. Medical records and transcripts show that Dean had 29 serious medical conditions during his 13 days in the hospital. Yet, he surprised the doctors with a full recovery. The medical staff at St. Francis Hospital named him the Miracle Man. The bad thing about being sick is if you go to the hospital, that's the worst place to be when you're sick or injured, because hospitals are so full of other sick people that there's bacteria and viruses literally everywhere, and it just passes from person to person. That's why in the old days, way back when Galen was running the medical facilities for Rome, all of the sick people were kept on one side of the hospital, and the injured were kept on the other side of the hospital. And there was only 4 patients to a room. Now, they didn't know what germs were back then. They just knew that you didn't put the sick ones with the injured ones, because then the injured ones would get sick as well. They also kept the hospital out in the country with plenty of fresh air and sunshine. The patients were taken out in the daytime to sit in the sunlight and then brought back into the rooms at night. Once again, they didn't know why. They just knew that it helped in their recovery. Well, Dean says that God healed him because he has a special job to do here on earth. Jesus made it clear that he needed him on earth more than he needed him in heaven. Dr. Irige says it's a miracle this man is alive and that he has no brain damage. This is exceptional because he was dead for such a long time and he had so much infection in his system. Dean said that Jesus told him something that keeps his feet firmly planted on the ground. Dean says, "I felt like he was saying, 'I need you there more than I need you here,' and I came to understand then how important it was for me to complete what God put me on this planet to do. The bottom line is, until I'm finished here, I cannot go back home. I tell people I am on my way home. Don't get me wrong, I'm on my way home. This is the pathway my Father says I have to go to get there." I got to wondering how people who believe in reincarnation would perceive an NDE, or people who have a different religion, different kind of gods. Depending on who you ask, a majority of people, or at least a lot of people from India, believe in reincarnation. I'm going to try to not screw up these names, but, well, I probably will. Kaju Bania was 32 years old when he became ill with fever and he died. He revived and he gave the following account of his NDE. 4 black messengers came and they grabbed him. He asked, "Where are you taking me?" But they didn't answer him. They took him up into the heavens and they seated him near God. His body had become quite small, as if he had shrunk somehow. There was an old lady sitting nearby. She had a pen in her hand, and there were clerks with heaps of books in front of them. Eventually, Bania was summoned before the clerks. One of the clerks said, "We don't need Kaju Bania, the trader. We had asked for Kaju Kumar, the potter. Take him back and bring the other man. This one has some life remaining." Bania didn't want to return to his former life, so he asked the clerks to give him some work to do so he could stay in heaven. They sent him to Yamraj, the Hindu god of death and justice. Yamraj asked Bania, "What do you want?" He told the god that he wanted to stay there. Yamraj told him to extend his hand. The god touched his palm, but Bania didn't see if he had placed anything in his hand or not. He felt himself being pushed into a downward direction. He recovered back on Earth. He later learned that a man by the name of Kaju Kumar had died at the exact same time that he was regaining consciousness. This experience changed Bania's outlook on life. He became a more honest and decent individual. Mangal Singh was not ill or at the brink of death. He was 72 years old when he had his NDE. He was laying on a cot when two people came, lifted him up, and took him with them. He recalls hearing a hissing sound, but he couldn't see anything. The two men brought him to a gate and set him down in the grass on ground that was sloping away from it. A man was there, and he reprimanded the men who had brought Mangal, saying, "Why have you brought the wrong person? Why have you not brought the man you were sent for?" The two men ran away, and the senior man said, "You go back." Mangal saw there were two big pots of boiling water. There was no fire, no fireplace, and no cause for the water to be boiling. The man pushed Mangal and said, "You had better hurry up and go back." When the old man touched him, he suddenly became aware of how hot this man's hands were. Then Mangal realized why the pots were boiling. The heat was coming from the old man's hands. Mangal awoke with a burning sensation on his left arm. He saw there was a boil on his skin. He went to a doctor who gave him some medication, but the spot left a scar. Mangal was sleeping at the time of the experience, but he thinks he was not dreaming. He later found out another person had died in the same location around the same time that he was having his experience. Howard Storm became a tenured art professor at Northern Kentucky University by age 27. He was a devout atheist. He says he was a know-it-all college professor, and universities are some of the most closed-minded places around. Not what you'd expect from a university, huh? On the last day of a 3-week European art tour, his group had returned to their hotel in Paris after visiting the artist Delacroix's home and studio. As Howard stood in his room with his wife and other students, suddenly he screamed and dropped to the floor in agony. He had a perforated duodenum, the first and shortest section of the small intestine. At first, Howard thought that he'd been shot. The pain was so sudden and so severe. He looked around the room trying to spot somebody with a gun. As he lay on the floor in pain, kicking and screaming, his wife called for an ambulance. He needed surgery immediately. This was like having a ruptured appendix. This was a definite life and death situation. It was just really bad luck that his illness happened on a Saturday. Here in the U.S., Level 1 is the highest level emergency department. They have to have immediately available surgical specialists and other people to handle any kind of a complication that can come from sickness or injury. A Level 4 emergency department is usually found in rural areas. They sometimes don't even have doctors on staff. They're intended to stabilize the patient only and then ship them to another hospital. Well, the emergency room staff in Paris put out a call for a surgeon to come in, and then they waited. They placed him on a bed, didn't have any sheets or pillows, and they were unable to give him any pain medication. Pain medication has to be approved by a doctor, and there was no doctor around to make the orders. He lay in the room for 10 hours. Intestinal contents were leaking into his abdominal cavity, which would soon lead to peritonitis, septic shock, and even death. A nurse came in and said they were still unable to find a doctor, but they were going to try some more the next day, which was Sunday. Howard was in so much pain that he just wanted to give up. He was terrified of dying, seeing as he was an atheist, and he knew that there was nothing beyond life. He said goodbye to his wife, and he told her to tell their friends and the rest of his family goodbye, and then he lost consciousness. He found himself standing in a room looking at a man laying in a bed. There was no longer any pain. He felt at peace. He felt alive. He tried to speak to his wife, seeing as she was in such sad shape, and no words came out. This inability to say anything confused him. There was no way the man in the bed could be him. He heard people outside the room calling to him, calling him by name. They spoke clear English, no French accent. He thought this was strange because the hospital was in Paris. People speak French in Paris, but these people were speaking just plain, clear English. They kept calling Howard to come join them, and they were in a hurry. Howard went to the doorway asking, "Are you guys from the doctor? I need to have surgery. I'm sick, and I've been waiting a long time." The people in the hallway answered with, "We know all about you. We've been waiting for you. It's time to go. Now hurry up." Not knowing what was going on, Howard began to follow these people as they walked away from the room. The lights were getting dim. Considering this was a hospital, that seemed a bit odd. They kept leading him on a long walk. The walls of the hospital were getting darker as they went. Soon there were no walls. It was just kind of a gray nothingness in all directions. Howard began to wonder why he felt no pain, and he wasn't tired even though they'd been walking for what felt like hours. He tried asking where they were going, but he was told to shut up. It kept getting darker. He said he wasn't going to go any farther, and this was answered with being grabbed by the other people, and they began dragging him along. He tried to stop, but this only got his guides to pull him along farther and faster, and when he finally refused to go any farther, they started beating him. They hit him with their fists, and then they started biting him. After a while, they lost interest in tormenting him, and he fell to the floor. Unable to move, Howard heard a voice, faint, but he heard a voice say he should pray. He told his voice he didn't believe in God and prayer was useless. The voice told him to pray anyway. Howard said he didn't know how to pray. He was still told to pray. He tried to remember a prayer that he'd heard many years ago, and he gave it a shot. The sound of prayer seemed to enrage those around him. They told him there was no God and that he should stop praying. He noticed as he mumbled his prayer These people seemed to get madder, but they also moved farther away. He began to shout out bits and pieces of the Lord's Prayer, and he was screaming anything that he thought might be a prayer. Even though he didn't believe in God, he saw he was all alone suddenly. The darkness had receded. Howard began to think about his life and the things he'd done, and he decided he'd not been a very good person, and his life had diminished once he'd gone to work at the university. The people he worked with were pretty much self-centered, self-seeking. Howard had passed his lack of faith on to his students. The people or beings that had been guiding him to his final resting place, maybe? These were creatures just like him. He didn't much like what looked like his final outcome. He hoped and prayed there was something better to look forward to. In a last desperate effort to not go to wherever it was he was headed, Howard began to ask Jesus for help. A brilliant light appeared that came closer and closer. He found himself bathed in light, and for the first time he could clearly see his own body was quite a mess. He looked like a piece of chewed meat that had been thrown to the floor. The light carried Howard upwards, and he felt great joy in being taken away from the darkness. Once he was away from the dark corridor, Howard was shown his past life, all the nasty things he had done, the people he had hurt, the lies he had told. He begged for forgiveness. He asked to be allowed to enter heaven. A voice told him he was not going to heaven. He was going back into his body. At 9 p.m., Howard was back in his hospital room in Paris. Less than 30 minutes had elapsed since he had lost consciousness. When he opened his eyes, he heard a nurse say that they had managed to find a surgeon who was going to come to the hospital right away. As they wheeled him out of the room, he saw his wife. He said everything is going to be really good from now on. She thought he was just trying to put on a brave face before he went away and maybe didn't come back. He kept telling his wife, "It's all love. We don't have to suffer anymore." His wife thought this was just the drugs talking. Howard tried to tell her about dying and being attacked by these dark beings, and he told her that he had prayed and been taken up to heaven. Well, she simply thought he'd lost his mind. He went through surgery okay and was wheeled back into his room, and he continued telling his wife about going to heaven and meeting Jesus and God and praying and all the things that they didn't believe were true. He kept talking about this until finally his wife decided she'd had enough of this nonsense, and she divorced him. Howard began to attend Christ Church in Fort Thomas, Kentucky. His pastor worked with him, and after 3 years, Howard was ordained as a lay minister in his church. Sensing a deeper calling, he attended United Theological Seminary in Dayton, Ohio, and later he became a pastor of a church in Covington, Ohio. He also wrote a book about his experience, My Descent into Death, which he says was written primarily for non-believers. Whether you believe in God or you have a higher power, there must be something more to life than living 60 or 70 years and then it's worm food. There must be something more to it than that. And I'd guess it's not 42. People here in the United States tell about seeing God as we understand him. In India, the folks who had NDEs saw God the way they understood him. I read a few NDEs from folks who are pagans. They all had out-of-body experiences without meeting God or a higher power. They did see light and they felt at peace. They just never met any all-powerful being. We can only take the NDE folks at their word. There's no way the boys in the white lab coats are ever going to be able to recreate an NDE. Well, unless they kill somebody and then bring them back to life. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, spread the word. Tell everybody to listen up. If you'd like to get a t-shirt or a coffee cup or maybe a grocery bag, you can go to tpublic.com and search for Strange Things with Chris James. If you'd like to buy a book, amazon.com. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things. And I can't find there it is.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murdered 3? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?